The wind had stopped by the time I reached the top of the ridge, which was the first thing that felt wrong. A storm like the one that had come through the Bitterroot corridor 2 nights earlier should have left a pressure system behind it that rangers can feel in their sinuses for another 48 hours. Instead, the air on the morning of October 3rd, 2018, was flat, warm for the season, and unnaturally still. I noted the anomaly in my patrol log because I had been trained to note everything. Then I continued down the eastern slope of what we called Sector 14 North, a stretch of high timber roughly 9 miles from the nearest maintained road. I was walking a wind-throw assessment. That is the least dramatic assignment in the entire backcountry division. When a windstorm knocks down a significant number of trees, a ranger walks the affected drainage and marks hazards, mostly for the trail crews that come through in the spring. The work is slow, methodical, and mostly involves counting. I had been doing it for 15 years, and I had learned to enjoy the quiet. Roughly 2 hours into the survey, I came across a Douglas fir that had gone over at the root ball. It was old, maybe 200 years, and when it fell, it had torn a crater about 11 feet across out of the hillside. That is normal. What was not normal was what was sitting at the bottom of the crater. At first I thought it was a coffee can. That is what the brain does when it encounters a rusted cylindrical object in the dirt. It offers a familiar shape. But as I stepped down into the disturbed soil, I could see it was not a can. It was a metal survey marker, roughly 4 inches in diameter, driven into a concrete pier that extended down into the earth beyond what I could see. The disc on top was heavily oxidized, the color of dried blood, and it had been sitting under that Douglas fir for a very long time. I put on nitrile gloves before I touched it, which is standard for any unlogged object recovered in the field. Then I cleared the dirt away with a soft brush from my kit. The stamp on the disc read in raised letters, "Do not disturb, permanent reference, serial Enca 4471-B elevation unmarked." There was no agency name, no USGS designation, no General Land Office marking, no Forest Service shield, no Bureau of Reclamation punch. Every survey monument I had ever encountered in 15 years of backcountry work bore, at minimum, the seal of the placing agency and a warning about federal penalties for tampering. This one had neither. It had a serial number and an instruction, and nothing else. I photographed the marker in situ from 4 cardinal angles, took a GPS reading with the Trimble unit clipped to my chest strap, and recorded the coordinates in my Greenfield notebook by hand as a redundancy. Then I noticed the second anomaly. The concrete pier was old, really old. The aggregate was river rock, hand-mixed, of a type that has not been used in federal survey installations since roughly the early 1950s. But the soil around the pier was fresh. Not fresh as in recent, exactly. Fresh as in disturbed. There were faint horizontal layers in the dirt around the base, the kind you see when a hole has been dug and filled many times over. When I pushed my trowel down along the edge of the pier, I found that the disturbed soil column extended at least 30 inches down before I hit undisturbed hardpan. That is not consistent with a marker that had simply been sitting under a tree. Someone had been coming here for a long time and digging it up. I stood in the crater for a while and did not move. That is a thing that happens to experienced rangers when they encounter something outside their frame of reference. You do not panic. You do not radio. You stand still and try to become a person who is capable of describing what they are looking at. Eventually I climbed out, sat on the trunk of the fallen Douglas fir, and radioed District. I gave them my grid, described the object as an unidentified survey monument, possibly historical, possible unauthorized placement, and requested guidance. Dispatch acknowledged and told me to hold position. That was the second thing that felt wrong. Standard procedure for an unidentified historical object is to complete documentation, secure the site with flagging tape, and continue patrol. There is no reason to hold position. I held position for 47 minutes. During that time, I did what any curious ranger would do. I opened the digital patrol tablet on my hip, connected to the district repeater, and queried the internal geospatial reference index for serial number NC-4471-B. The system returned a match. The match was dated August 14th, 1962. According to the record, marker NC-4471-B had been discovered by a Ranger E. Halloran during a routine patrol of what was then designated the Powell Creek watershed, approximately 83 miles northwest of my current position. The record was flagged with a code I had never seen before. 3 letters. TRN. There was a scanned image attached to the record, and I opened it. It was the same marker, the same oxidation pattern, the same stamped serial number, the same absence of an agency seal. The photograph had been taken with a large format field camera in black and white, and it showed a young man in a felt ranger hat kneeling beside the disc, with a folding rule for scale. The concrete pier in his photograph looked, if anything, older than the one in front of me. I stared at the image for a long time. Then I queried the serial number again to confirm I had not made a mistake. The system returned the same record, NC-4471-B, 1962, Powell Creek, Ranger E. Halloran. There was a small link at the bottom of the record labeled See Related Entries. I tapped it. 14 entries appeared. The earliest was dated 1947. The latest was dated 2011. Every single one referenced serial number NC-4471-B. Every single one had been filed by a different ranger in a different district of the Montana Park System. Every single one had a scanned photograph attached, and in every photograph the marker was identical. The pier, the oxidation, the stamp, the absence of a seal. Every single record was flagged TRN. And every single record ended the same way. There was a field labeled Final Disposition. In 14 out of 14 entries, that field contained the same 9-character string. Transferred, no destination, no investigating supervisor, no case closure code. Just the word, sitting there in the disposition field like the record itself had walked off a cliff. The rotor noise reached me before I saw the helicopter. That was the third thing that felt wrong. My district did not have a helicopter on standby that morning. I knew this because I had checked the operational board at 05:30 before leaving the station. There had been no aviation asset assigned to the Bitterroot corridor. Yet here was a Bell 407 in the district's green and cream livery, coming up the drainage from the southwest, well below the ridgeline, flown by someone who clearly knew the terrain. It set down on a bald patch of scree, about 200 yards below me. 3 men got out. One I recognized. His name was Dale Voss, and he was the district's assistant superintendent for resource protection. A man I had spoken to perhaps 6 times in 15 years, always briefly, always in his office in Missoula. The other 2 I did not recognize. They were older than Voss, both wearing plain green field jackets without name tags, and they moved up the slope with the unhurried competence of people who had done this walk before. Voss reached me first. He was breathing hard from the climb, but he smiled the way a man smiles when he wants to keep a conversation civil. "Ranger," he said, "appreciate you holding tight. Can you walk me through what you found?" I walked him through it. I showed him the marker. I showed him the disturbed soil column. I mentioned, because I was still trying to be helpful, that I had queried the serial number in the GR1 and pulled up 14 matching records dating back to 1947. Voss's expression did not change. But one of the older men, the one with the gray mustache, made a small sound in the back of his throat that I have thought about many times since. It was not surprise. It was the sound a mechanic makes when he lifts the hood of a car and sees exactly what he expected to see. "All right," Voss said. "We're going to take it from here. I need your tablet, your notebook, and your camera. Standard evidence handoff. You'll get replacements at the station." I gave him the tablet and the camera. I hesitated on the notebook. A ranger's field notebook is a personal document. It contains contact information, weather observations, private notes, sketches. Voss saw my hesitation. "We'll photocopy the non-relevant pages and return the copies to you," he said. "The original stays with the site file." I handed him the notebook. He thanked me. Then he asked me, in the same civil tone, whether I would prefer to hike out or ride the helicopter back to the trailhead. I said I would hike. He nodded as if he had expected that, and told me the sector would be closed for a geotechnical assessment for the next several weeks, and that I should route my remaining patrols through 14 South until further notice. I walked out. It took me 6 hours. The whole way down, I kept thinking about the 14 records, and the word transferred, and the sound the older man had made in the back of his throat. When I got back to the ranger station that evening, I logged into the GR1 on the office workstation and searched for serial number NC-4471-B. The system returned no records. I searched for the marker by coordinates. Nothing. I searched for the code TRN. Nothing. I searched for Ranger E. Halloran, 1962, Powell Creek. Halloran existed in the personnel archive. His patrol records for August 1962 existed. But the entry for August 14th, 1962, which I had read on my tablet less than 8 hours earlier, was gone. In its place was a short entry describing a routine timber assessment with no unusual findings. I sat in the office for a long time with my hand on the mouse. Then I opened the incident log for my own patrol that morning and found that my report had been replaced. The new report was 3 sentences long. It described a wind-throw-induced soil disturbance in Sector 14 North and recommended a follow-up erosion assessment in the spring. It was signed with my ranger number. I had not written it. I went home. I did not sleep. The next morning I did something I had never done in 15 years. I lied to my supervisor. I told him I had left a piece of personal equipment, a good headlamp, in the archive room in Missoula during my last records review, and I asked if I could drive down and retrieve it. He said, "Sure. Take the government vehicle. Log the mileage." I drove the 2.5 hours to Missoula and walked into the district archive as if I had every right to be there, because technically I did. The archive is in the basement of the old administrative building. It contains, among other things, the paper records of every district investigation from 1908 to the digitization cutover in 2004. Everything after 2004 exists only in the GR1. Everything before 2004 exists in bankers' boxes on steel shelves in a climate-controlled room. Senior investigators have unrestricted access. I qualified as a senior investigator. I started with 1962. Halloran's paper patrol log for August of that year was there. It was a small green field notebook, identical in format to the one I had surrendered to Voss the day before. I turned to August 14th. The page had been removed, not torn, cut. A very clean cut along the binding, the kind you would make with a straight edge and a scalpel. The stub of the missing page was visible in the gutter. The page before it ended mid-sentence, describing a beaver dam assessment on Powell Creek. The page after it began mid-sentence, describing the drive back to the station. Whatever Halloran had written about NC-4471B had been surgically removed from his notebook, probably decades ago, by someone who had access to this room. I checked the other 13 dates I remembered from the GRY. I remembered them because I had trained myself to remember dates. In every single case, the corresponding page in the corresponding Ranger's Field notebook was missing. Same clean cut, same stub in the gutter. In 3 of the notebooks, the excision had been done so long ago that the paper edges had yellowed to match the rest of the pages. I sat down on the floor between 2 shelves, and I understood something for the first time. The removals were not a cover-up in the sense that most people mean the word. They were a procedure. Someone had been doing this, in this room, for at least 70 years, and whoever it was knew exactly which pages to cut, and did not bother to hide that they had cut them. The stubs were left in place. The notebooks were returned to their boxes. The record showed, quite openly, that a page had been removed. It just did not show what the page had said. That was when I noticed the shelf. The archive is organized by year, and each year takes up roughly 3 linear feet of shelving. The years from 1908 to the present march along the wall in a continuous ribbon of green boxes. There is exactly 1 gap. The years 1971, 1972, 1973, and 1974 are missing. In their place is a laminated tag zip-tied to the shelf brace, printed on faded card stock, that reads, "Records transferred to Central. Contact Regional Historian." I had walked past that tag 100 times over the years and never thought about it. Records get transferred, buildings flood, rats get into boxes, archivists reorganize. There are a dozen ordinary reasons for a gap. But I stood in front of it now with the taste of copper in my mouth, and I understood that whatever had happened in 1972 or 1973 had been serious enough that 4 entire years of district records had been walked out of this building and never returned. I photographed the shelf with my personal phone. I photographed Halloran's cut notebook. I photographed several of the others. Then I put everything back exactly as I had found it, signed out of the archive, drove home, and spent the evening looking at aerial photographs of the Powell Creek watershed on the state's public GIS server. The Powell Creek watershed does not exist. That is not quite accurate. There is a Powell Creek. It flows out of the Sapphire Mountains and joins the Bitterroot River near Corvallis. But there is no watershed unit in the park system's administrative geography by that name. There never has been. I checked the historical boundary files back to 1935. Powell Creek has always been part of a larger management unit, and that unit has been called various things over the decades. But Powell Creek Watershed is not now, and has never been an official district designation. Yet Halloran's 1962 patrol had been logged as occurring in the Powell Creek watershed, and when I went back through my memory of the other 13 GRI entries I had read on my tablet, I realized they had all been logged as occurring in place names that did not correspond to any real administrative unit. Boulder Fork Reserve, 9 Mile Timber Allotment, Sawtell Draw Preserve. None of them existed. I pulled the coordinates. This took most of a week, because I had to work from memory and from my personal phone photographs of the archive shelf, and from cross-references in unrelated documents. But when I finally plotted all 14 historical discoveries on a topographic map, using the coordinates from the archived records rather than the place names, they all fell within a circle roughly 1/4 of a mile in diameter. Every single one. Every discovery of NC4471b since 1947 had occurred within 1/4 mile of the same point, in the Bitterroot corridor. But every single incident report had described the location as a different place, in a different district, sometimes hundreds of miles apart. The place names were fictional. The coordinates were the same. And the coordinates were within GPS error the exact location where I had found the marker on October 3rd. I want to be clear about how I felt at this point in my investigation, because I have read enough accounts of this kind of thing to know that the usual word used is terror. I did not feel terror. I felt something colder and more useful, which was the professional certainty that I was looking at a pattern that had been maintained by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Terror is what you feel when you do not understand. What I felt was the beginning of understanding, and it was worse. I began, quietly, to talk to people. Not the people at my station, the retired ones. Rangers who had rotated out of the district in the 80s and 90s and were now living in small towns along the Bitterroot and the Clark Fork, growing tomatoes and complaining about their pensions. I drove out to see them on my days off. I did not tell them what I had found. I asked general questions. How had things changed? What did they miss? Was there anything from their careers that still bothered them? Most of them were happy to talk. They told me stories about missing hikers and helicopter crashes and the year the wolves came back. A few of them, when I mentioned Sector 14 North or the Bitterroot Corridor, went quiet in a way that I recognized. They changed the subject. They offered me more coffee. One of them, a woman named Marge Kowalski, who had been a district investigator from 1978 to 1996, looked at me for a long time across her kitchen table and said, "You found one, didn't you?" I did not answer. She said, "Don't. Just don't. Whatever you're doing, put it down and walk away. That is the only useful thing I can tell you." I asked her about 1972. She stood up and left the room. She did not come back. After 10 minutes, I let myself out. I drove home along the river. It was late October by then, and the cottonwoods were yellow along the banks. I had been on the investigation for 3 weeks, and I had lost 8 pounds, and I was drinking more than I should have been. I understood that I was on a path that had ended careers before mine. I understood that the sensible thing to do was to stop. I did not stop. The next thing I did was request a copy of my own replaced incident report through the official records channel. This was procedurally normal. Rangers request copies of their own reports all the time. The request took 9 days to process. When the report arrived in my inbox, I opened it and found the 3-sentence version I remembered, the one describing a wind-throw-induced soil disturbance. But there was a metadata field at the bottom of the PDF that showed the document history. It listed my original report, time-stamped 11:47 on October 3rd, and then a replacement, time-stamped 14:22 on the same day. The replacement had been uploaded by a user account I did not recognize. The account name was a string of 8 characters, and next to it was a designation I had never seen in 15 years of using the system: TRN-desk. I searched the internal directory for TRN-desk. There was no such office, no such role, no such person. But when I searched the system audit logs for other actions taken by the TRN-desk account, I found hundreds of them, going back to the beginning of the digital record in 2004. The account had modified reports, replaced photographs, updated coordinates, and closed investigations across every district in the state. It was active roughly twice a month. Its actions were always the same. It rewrote something, and then it went quiet again. I understood then that TRN was not a code applied to certain records. TRN was an office, a desk, a function within the Park Service that had existed for at least 70 years, and that had a single job, which was to keep certain findings from ever settling into the official memory of the institution. The people who staffed it were not villains. They were archivists. They handled a category of discovery that the rest of us were not equipped to file. I began to wonder how many of them there were, and where they sat, and who paid them, and whether they thought of themselves as part of the Park Service at all. That was when I made the mistake that ended my career. I sent an email. I sent it to a former colleague, a man named Tom Reyes, who had left the service in 2015 to work for a private surveying firm in Bozeman. Tom had been my mentor when I first started, and he was one of the most careful, decent people I had ever known. I did not tell him what I had found. I asked him in general terms whether he had ever encountered a survey marker with a serial number beginning NC4 during his time in the district. I said I was doing some historical research. Tom did not reply. 3 days later, on a Thursday morning, Voss called me into the district office in Missoula. He did not ask about the marker. He did not mention Tom. He told me, with the same civil smile he had used on the ridge in October, that my performance reviews over the past year had raised concerns about my fitness for backcountry duty. He said the service was going to place me on administrative leave, pending a medical evaluation. He said this was a supportive measure, and that I should think of it as an opportunity to rest. I asked him what specifically in my performance had raised concerns. He said he was not at liberty to discuss the details. I asked him whether I could see my personnel file. He said I could, through the standard request channel, and that the request would take approximately 90 days to process. I turned in my radio and my sidearm, and my keys, and I drove home. That night, sitting at my kitchen table, I did the last useful piece of investigation I have ever done. I laid out everything I had, which by then filled a plastic tote. Photographs, handwritten notes, printouts, the coordinates from the 14 historical discoveries, my personal phone photos of the cut notebooks and the missing shelf. I laid it all out, and I looked at it the way I would have looked at evidence in a search and rescue case, which is to say I stopped asking what happened and started asking what the evidence would look like if a particular hypothesis were true. The hypothesis I tested was this. The marker was not the point. The marker was a label. Whoever installed the original monument in the 1940s, or whenever it had actually been installed, had been marking a specific location for a specific reason. Every subsequent discovery was a rediscovery of the same object at the same coordinates, and each generation of rangers had documented it, and the TRN desk had quietly filed each documentation under a different fictional place name to prevent the pattern from being obvious to anyone who did not have access to the coordinates themselves. But if the marker had been sitting in the same spot since the 1940s, why did it keep being discovered? Why not once, and then never again? The answer was in the disturbed soil. The marker was being excavated and reburied repeatedly. Someone or something was moving earth around it on a regular cycle, exposing it to a fallen tree or an erosion event. And then the site was quietly restored between discoveries, except that when I sat with that hypothesis for a while, it stopped making sense. The disturbed soil column I had documented in the crater was 30 inches deep. 30 inches of vertically layered disturbance is not the result of someone digging up a marker every 20 years. It is the result of the marker itself moving through the soil column, rising over time through the earth. I did not believe that at first. I am a trained professional, and I do not believe things that violate the physics of soil mechanics. So I went back to my data. I pulled up the elevation notation on the marker itself. Elev, unmarked. Every legitimate survey monument in the United States has an elevation stamped on it. That is the entire purpose of a survey monument, to provide a reference elevation. The NC 4471-B disc did not have one, because whoever made it knew the elevation would not stay constant. I went back through the 14 historical records I could reconstruct from memory and from my archive photographs. The recorded elevations, when I could find them, were not identical. They increased, not by much, a few millimeters per decade, but they increased. The marker was, over the span of 70-plus years, slowly rising out of the ground at a rate that was too slow to observe in any single visit, but perfectly documentable across generations. I stared at that for a long time. Then I looked at the aerial photographs. The Park Service maintains a photographic survey program that flies the entire district on a rotating basis, roughly once every 5 years, using calibrated aerial cameras from a fixed altitude. The photographs are stored in the regional archive and are public record. I had spent that afternoon downloading every available image of the Bitterroot Corridor from 1954 to 2016. If you look at any one of those photographs in isolation, you see a forest. It is a normal forest. But if you overlay them in sequence, registered to the same coordinate grid, and you focus on the quarter-mile circle where NC 4471B keeps appearing, you can see something that no single ranger walking through the woods would ever notice. The trees in that circle are wrong. They are not wrong in the sense of being dead, or diseased, or the wrong species. They are wrong in the sense that over 60 years of aerial imagery, the canopy inside that circle has changed at a rate that does not match the canopy outside it. Trees appear in the circle that were not there 5 years earlier. Not saplings that have grown. Full mature trees, 30 and 40 feet tall, standing in locations where the previous survey shows open ground. And other trees disappear. Not fallen, not cut, simply absent from the next survey, with no stumps, no wind throw, no evidence on the ground of ever having been there. The forest inside the quarter-mile circle is being edited. Slowly, quietly, on a timescale that is invisible to any individual observer but obvious in the aggregate record. Whatever process is doing this uses the survey marker as a reference point, or perhaps the survey marker is a byproduct of the process, or perhaps the two things are the same thing described from different angles. I do not know. Nobody I have spoken to knows. The people who staffed the TRN desk in 1947 did not know either. They simply understood that something in the Bitterroot Corridor was not finished, and that their job was to make sure the paperwork did not force anyone to admit it. I want to describe one more thing, because it is the last piece of the investigation I did before I stopped, and it is the thing that I think about most often, now, in the years since. Among the aerial photographs I downloaded was a series from June of 1973. The 1973 survey was flown by a contractor named Northwestern Aerial Services out of Spokane, and it covers the entire Bitterroot corridor at a scale of 1 to 24,000. I looked at the frames that included my quarter-mile circle. In every other year of the survey record, the circle contains forest. Different forest, changing forest, edited forest, but forest. In June of 1973, the circle contains a clearing. The clearing is roughly a quarter of a mile across, which is the size of the circle itself. Inside the clearing, the ground is bare, and there are what appear to be structures. Small ones, not buildings. More like frames or scaffolds, arranged in a pattern I could not decipher from the resolution available. The photographs are grainy, and the shadows are long because the flight was made in the early morning, and I cannot tell you what those structures were. I can tell you that they are the reason 4 years of district records were removed from the archive. I can also tell you that in the 1978 survey, 5 years later, the clearing is gone. The forest has returned. The trees inside the circle are mature, 50, 60, 70 years old by the look of them. There is no stump field. There is no regrowth pattern. In 5 years, the forest inside the circle has aged approximately 70 years, and there is no record anywhere in the Park Service system that acknowledges this fact. I called Marge Kowalski one more time. I did not drive out. I called her from my kitchen. I asked her, without preamble, what had been in the clearing in 1973. There was a long silence on her end of the line. Then she said, "You need to stop calling me. You need to stop looking at this. I am asking you as someone who cared about the people I worked with. Please stop." I asked her again what had been in the clearing. She said, "It was building itself." Then she hung up. I do not know what she meant. I have thought about it for years, and I have several theories, none of which I will write down here because I do not want to be the person who commits them to paper. But I will say this. When you have spent 15 years in the backcountry, you develop a certain relationship with the forest. You come to understand that the forest is not a thing but a process. It is always in the middle of becoming something. Trees fall and rot and feed other trees. Fires burn and clear ground. The forest is never done. But most of the forest is becoming something at a rate that a human being can live with. It changes at the pace of a human lifetime, or a few human lifetimes, and we can measure it and manage it and pretend to understand it. The quarter-mile circle in the Bitterroot corridor is becoming something at a different rate. Sometimes it is faster than us, and sometimes it is slower. And once in 1973, it stopped becoming a forest for a while and became something else. And the people who saw it happening cut the pages out of their notebooks and walked away and did not talk about it for the rest of their lives. The medical evaluation determined that I was suffering from occupational stress and that a return to backcountry duty was not recommended. I was offered a desk position in Helena, which I declined. I took my early pension. I moved to a small house outside Hamilton, which is closer to the Bitterroot corridor than a sensible person would live. But I did not want to leave the valley. I have never been able to explain that to my sister, who lives in Denver. and who thinks I should have moved years ago. For a while I thought about writing a book. I thought about contacting a journalist. I did neither. The evidence I had was in isolation, deniable. The photograph on my phone could be dismissed as showing a badly organized archive. The aerial photographs were publicly available and required a very specific kind of analysis to reveal their pattern. My personal notes were the notes of a man who had been placed on medical leave for occupational stress. Anyone who wanted to make the evidence go away could do so without much effort. Also, and I want to be honest about this, I was tired. The investigation had cost me my career and part of my health, and I did not want to give it any more of my life. I filed the tote in the back of my closet, and I went about the business of being a retired man. I fished, I read, I did some volunteer trail work for a local land trust on trails that had nothing to do with the Bitterroot corridor. Years passed. I was, for a while, almost at peace. Then last spring I received an email. It was from the National Geospatial Reference Registry, which is a public database that anyone can subscribe to. Members of the public who register can request alerts when new survey monuments are added to the system in a geographic region of their choosing. I had registered for alerts covering the Bitterroot corridor years ago, out of the professional habit of a retired ranger, and I had received exactly the sort of alerts you would expect. New USGS benchmark near Stevensville. New Department of Transportation reference monument on Highway 93. Normal, boring, real. The email that arrived last spring was different. It notified me that a new monument had been registered in the system. The serial number was NC-4471-C. The letter had advanced one position in the sequence. The installing agency field was blank. The registered installation date was 6 months in the future, and the coordinates, when I plotted them, corresponded to a point roughly 40 feet north of the front porch of the ranger station, where I had worked for 15 years. The station itself was still active. My replacement was probably sitting at my old desk when the alert went out. I sat on my porch for most of that afternoon, and I looked at the email on my phone and I thought about the sequence. NC-4471-B had been in the ground since at least the 1940s. NC-4471-C had a future installation date. That meant, if the sequence meant anything at all, that whatever had been slowly becoming inside the quarter-mile circle in the Bitterroot corridor was not the only site. There were others. There had always been others. Each one had its own letter and its own timeline and its own quiet process of becoming. And the letters were moving forward, and the Park Service, or whatever part of it staffed the TRN desk, was already preparing the paperwork for the next one. I have not been back to Sector 14 North. I have not driven past my old ranger station. I have not contacted the current ranger there, whom I do not know, and I have not warned her about anything, because I do not know what I would tell her that would be useful. The marker has not been installed yet. When it is installed, or when it appears, or when it rises out of the ground the way the last one did, no single person will be able to see the pattern. It will look like a piece of old surveying equipment that someone forgot to remove. Some ranger, some morning, will walk past it and note it in a patrol log, and someone at the TRN desk will quietly replace the report with something more manageable, and the process will continue. I am writing this down because I am 61 years old, and I have been carrying it alone for a long time, and I have decided that the record should exist somewhere outside the plastic tote in my closet. I am not asking anyone to act on it. I am not naming the district or the specific coordinates or the current staff of the station, because I do not want to draw attention to a place that has enough attention on it already. I am simply saying, for whatever it is worth, that if you spend enough time in the back country of western Montana, you will eventually walk past a small rusted disc set into an old concrete pier, half buried in the duff, with a serial number stamped on it and no agency seal. You will probably not notice it. If you do notice it, you will probably decide it is not important. I am telling you that it is important. I am telling you that the forest around it is not the same forest it was 50 years ago, and that in another 50 years it will not be the forest you are looking at now, and that the change is not natural in any sense of the word that a park ranger uses. I am telling you that there are people whose job it has been, for at least 70 years, to make sure you do not notice this, and that they are very good at their job, and that they are not villains, and that I do not entirely blame them. I am telling you that somewhere in a federal database, right now, there is a serial number that has not yet been assigned to a monument, that has not yet been placed at a location, that has not yet finished becoming what it will be, and that when the installation date arrives, 6 months from the day I received the email, something will be standing 40 feet north of the porch of my old ranger station that was not standing there the day before, and it will look old, and the concrete will look weathered, and the disc will look as if it has been in the ground since before any of us were born. That is the part that I want you to sit with, not the marker itself, the date on the marker, because a survey marker is supposed to record where something has been measured. It is supposed to be a piece of the past, driven into the ground so that the future can find it and know where it stands. That is what a monument is. That is what every ranger I ever worked with believed a monument to be. The markers in the Bitterroot corridor are not that. They are the opposite of that. They are pieces of the future, driven backward into the ground, so that the past will know where to arrive. And the forest around them is not growing. It is being remembered, slowly and imperfectly, by something that has not yet decided what shape the remembering will take. If you are ever walking in the high timber of western Montana, after a windstorm, and you come across a Douglas fir that has gone over at the root ball, and there is something rusted at the bottom of the crater that looks like a coffee can, do what I did not do. Do not photograph it. Do not record the coordinates. Do not query the serial number. Cover it back up with duff and walk away, and do not tell anyone what you saw. It has been waiting a long time to be found. It can wait a little longer. And if you ever drive past a small ranger station in the Bitterroot Valley, 6 months from the day someone somewhere receives an automated email from a geospatial registry, and you notice a fresh disturbance in the dirt about 40 feet north of the front porch, and there is a woman in a green uniform standing over it with a puzzled expression on her face, and a radio in her hand. Do not stop. Do not offer to help. Do not tell her what I have told you. She has a job to do, and the desk in Missoula has a job to do, and the forest has a job to do, and none of them will thank you for interfering. I am telling you this because I interfered once, and it cost me everything except my life, and I have spent the years since trying to understand what I actually saw. I have not succeeded. I do not expect to. Some discoveries are not meant to be closed. They are meant to be transferred from one generation of quiet professionals to the next, until the thing they describe finishes becoming whatever it is becoming, and the paperwork can finally be filed under a real place name, in a real district, with a real disposition code, and the record can rest. Until then, the markers will keep appearing. The letters will keep advancing. The forest will keep editing itself in the aerial photographs that nobody overlays. And somewhere in Montana, at any given moment, there is a ranger who has just found something they cannot explain, and a helicopter is already in the air, and the report they have not yet written is already being replaced. I hope for her sake that she gives them the notebook.